Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. My guest today is an author of urban fantasy, sci-fi, space opera, Weird West, and most know of her from her Silver Series and the Amsterdam Institute series. Welcome, Rhiannon Held, aka RZ Held.
Thank you.
See, I pay attention to my stuff, kind of, sort of, maybe, at least this time. How are you doing and welcome? Thank you for coming.
Good. Thank you.
So before we start today, because we mentioned those things, but one thing I didn't mention, and something that I'm just going to start right off the bat, is you're also an archaeologist.
I am a professional archaeologist.
And
I think my Twitter says something about two sexy yet misunderstood professions that don't really make you money.
yeah,
But I will admit that archaeology does pay my rent.
well, that's what
So
matters, right? And yours is you focus more on like now correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like environmental
yeah, so
stuff.
it's a environmental compliance firm.
Okay.
So it's a company that I work for that does when there's going to be development, we check like a bunch of stuff to make sure that like there's not the only breeding pair of endangered frogs on the site, or
Oh
there's not a
wow.
super important wetland, or things like that. And archaeology is part of that, so we make sure no frogs, no super important wetlands, also no cultural resources is what it's called. Um, and so we aren't looking for archaeology. We were checking to make sure that it's not there so it won't get damaged by
Okay.
development going forward.
Okay. Have there been times where you've run across stuff like stuff that people usually see as archaeology, like, oh, this is a holy site that people didn't know about, or like you find like you said the endangered species. Have you run across that a lot, or?
Um, Not as much as people think, because there's sort of this, that you get this sort of narrative, like in fiction, a lot of times, like archaeology doesn't want development to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we are living in cities just as much as anybody. So, like, the example I like to use, because you really need them if you need a new sewage treatment plant. Um, Me, as much as anybody living in some city, really wants a new sewage treatment plant as opposed to the existing one, like overflowing into the river. Like, that
Right.
ain't good. So, we do want it to go forward when they're going to build a new one on this parcel of land. But we don't want it to damage anything. And so there's something called data recovery, which is where we would do an excavation to get something out of the ground if you can't put, our hypothetical sewage treatment plant anywhere else. And so the stuff that we find, we have had some super cool sites of various kinds. And some of them we can be like, hey, you have a road, you could send it this way, you could send it that way, send it that way because there's something here. Or there's ones where we have been like, okay, let's excavate it and get it out of there. And then as far as like the words we would use are traditional cultural places,
Okay.
which is sort of the spiritually important places. And the thing about those is that people know where they are. You just have to ask them, because we work really closely with the tribes and the tribal archaeologists and all people like that. And so part of bigger projects is saying to the tribes who that was their traditional homeland, like, what's there, is something important there? What can you tell us? Because we want to be respectful and not, hurt anything that's there.
Right. Right. Do you find that life that you've had, that experiences that you've had, have been useful for writing some of your books?
Yes. It's interesting, like over time, talking about how archaeology has gone into my writing as well, because in the beginning it was subtle, and I know it's there, and people wouldn't necessarily know it's there. I'll name drop one of my books. It's actually a collection. It's got a couple of novellas
Yeah.
that has an archaeologist character, which is Lady's Children. So even if you haven't read the Silver series, you can read Lady's Children, because it's got the archaeology character, and archaeology is actually done on screen. So it's like archaeology of the werewolves.
Okay.
Um, so that was later. And so in the initial stages of the Silver series, I'm like, well, it really plays into like the werewolves. They're a species rather than humans who were turned by a bite or something.
Right.
So being a species, they have their own history, their own religion, their own sort of traditions and oral history and etc. And so that was all sort of like bubbling below the surface, but it
Yeah.
wasn't, there in a huge way. But then in the space opera series, my current one that I'm working on, the Amsterdam Institute series, I'm like, I'm just going to put it in your face. Because that one, the novellas 1 and 2 are one protagonist, 3 and 4 are another protagonist, and then 5 or 6. 6 hasn't come out yet, or later this year. Those are a third protagonist, and they're in different eras. So what that lets me do is say, okay, here's the world in the first era, and then jump a couple hundred years. Here's a new character going about her business, whatever. But things are different slightly.
Okay.
Like, new planetary empires have sort of risen, and they have a little bit of cultural continuity, but things have changed a little bit, and like the language is changing. They use different slang, and so that in a big way is using sort of my archaeology and looking at kind of like cultures over time. They do have continuity, but they also sort of change. So
Okay. So we're talking about the Silver Series. Give us an overall kind of scope of kind of how that came to be, that series in particular.
So I attended as a sort of aspiring writer when I was learning my craft. I attended the Odyssey workshop,
Okay.
Which is a bit like Clarion in that it's a residential 6-week workshop. They've actually changed format now. So it's online because of the pandemic, but then they took it to sort of purposely online going forward now. So at that time, I was honing my craft through short stories, which I still write now. But at that workshop, a lot of other people were doing novels, and I was sort of like, well, maybe I should be doing novels. I don't know.
Yeah.
And Jean Cavellos, who runs the workshop, was like, don't write a novel until you can not write, until you can't keep yourself from writing a novel. And I was like, So a couple years later, because of some personal life stuff that, I won't, kind of talk about just because the people involved, I don't, I don't bear them any ill will. But I was like, you know what? I can't keep myself from writing a novel. I want something to just like consume me and fill my time. And that was Silver, the very first novel. It wasn't called that at the time because, of course, your title changes who knows how many times. But and then from there, with the revision process, and so I worked on it for many years. But then I eventually sold it. And then I sold the first 3 to Tor, the traditional publisher, and then Tor decided not to pick up 4.
Okay.
So 4 and 5, which finish out the main series, I self-published them. And Ladies' Children sort of is a collection of not only the short fiction, but the novellas in it sort of like jump ahead a little bit and sort of wrap up the larger world rather than the sort of like close events of the first 5.
And is Mistaken Captives also in that same world?
Yeah, so Mistaken Captives is collected in Ladies' Children. So there's 2 novellas, and one of them was released on its own to sort of, because it parallels the events of book 5 or book 4, one of the 2. This is terrible. I'm turning into one of those authors like, which book did that happen in? Anyway,
they'll have to read them all and find out, right?
Exactly, right? It parallels the events of one of those 2. And so I wanted it to be sort of there as kind of the DVD extra. And then that's got the archaeologist character. I returned to that character in Ladies' Children for a second novella.
Yeah, I was very curious because looking at them, those 2 have very similar covers. And they really stood out to me. I'm like, they got to be part of the same series. And I was like, but it doesn't say they're part of the same. I don't. Okay, Goodreads, come on now. Hook me up here. Give me some information. So I don't look like an idiot when I'm asking questions. But they just those particular covers just jumped out at me, and I was like, those are really cool. I mean, all the
Yeah, I got
covers
a
are pretty awesome,
great
but
cover artist.
so tell us about the main character from that and kind of how what the story of that is, if you would, because the main
Sure.
characters, like the two main characters, from what I understand, are werewolves, right? And one of
Yes.
them can't necessarily shift. Do I have that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
See me, people that are listening are like, what did he just do? He just did that fist, like, yes, I got it.
So the Silver series, it follows Silver herself, that's the name she chose, and then Andrew Dare, descended from the Dares of the Roanoke colony, which was half werewolves. So
Okay.
here I am. I'm getting to the world building history of
Yeah.
the werewolves. And Silver was injected with silver nitrate. So not only can't she shift anymore, her arm, where the arm where it was injected, is dead. She can't really use it. She gets a little sort of mobility back, but it's never going to be like 100%.
Yeah.
And also it caused brain damage. So Silver herself sees kind of visions, and how she thinks about it, which is kind of one of the central contrasts of the series, is that Andrew Dare is an atheist. And so he's looking for very grounded scientific explanations for everything that's happening. I mean, other than I have people sometimes say, like, how can he not believe in the gods? Because he's a werewolf and that's magic. And I'm like, well, but I mean, it's the kind of magic that you take for granted. Like there's a certain magic in the inherent, I think, in the natural world, in terms of like we can make copies of ourselves, and they grow up, and then they're a different consciousness. And what is consciousness? Like
Yeah.
consciousness kind of magic, right? So Andrew's an atheist, and then Silver is she views her visions as visions of the religious realm. So their goddess is called the Lady, and she's paired with death in sort of the yin yang duality kind of thing.
Okay.
And so Silver speaks with death, but she feels that the silver nitrate in her blood has kept her from being able to see or talk to the goddess anymore. But she sees her visions as kind of the spiritual realm,
Okay.
that she sort of exists a little bit in it. So the books were fun to write, tough, very tough in some ways, but because Silver's point of view, she doesn't see our world in the same way. And so then you need to lean on, when you're writing, the other point of view characters who can see that, like, okay, now they are in a house or whatever, as opposed to she's seeing an open field with a spring in the center, or something like that.
Okay.
So it was fun to play with perspectives that are that different
Yeah.
from each other.
So my next question is going to be the $1,000,000 question. Why choose werewolves as opposed to any other supernatural type of being out there?
Oh, let's see, cast my mind back. So I was writing this 2009 or so. So that was, urban fantasy was huge, and
Yeah.
I was really enjoying urban fantasy.
Okay.
I did some LARPing in World of Darkness.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that was a little bit on my mind. And the first time that I LARPed World of Darkness was when I went to undergrad. And so World of Darkness was my first introduction to the idea of sort of taking the supernatural and then fitting it within the modern world, but sort of in the werewolf game, there's the Glasswalker clan, which is the werewolves who are like really citified, and
Yeah.
they're always in skyscrapers or whatever. And that was the first time. I won't say like they invented the idea. It was the first time I encountered that idea.
Right.
And it really resonated with me, the contrast of the sort of wild and supernatural, but being in a city, living in a city, and sort of turning that wild supernatural magic to sort of urban ends.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that contrast. And I specifically went with werewolves over, say, like vampires or something, because I felt like they would be really good to do as a species. And because I really specifically wanted this feeling that these are people who have a history, have a religion, have all sort of that sort of going, the tradition going into them, as opposed to a vampire who has their history and their people and their tradition, and then they're turned. And
Right.
now, as whatever age they're turned at, hopefully an adult, now as an adult, they are thrust into the vampire culture. And I'm like, I want werewolf culture that is completely from the word go, all werewolf, no human.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. And I can see how that would encompass some of that archaeology too background, where you kind of see you're understanding cultures and kind of how they work
Yeah.
as well. So, all right. So your other pretty well-known series, which you have a new book that just came out not long ago, is called the Amsterdam Series, Amsterdam Institute
Yeah.
Series. I knew that when I put down my notes, I have it in one place, but in the other place, I missed the Institute. I was like, nope, nope, nope. I know that's not what it is. Tell us a little bit about this one.
So that one, it was my sort of first foray into space opera, and then I discovered that I super love space opera. So that's
Yeah.
why I sort of expanded it into a whole series. I wanted to look at sort of the idea of technology changing you, but you're still you, but who is that you anymore?
Right.
So the technology changes with what I was talking about, the different sort of eras in this
Mhm.
universe. But the central theme is that it's changing something about the body or the mind. And the other thing is that it happens without the protagonist's consent.
Oh,
So in the first one, she's infected with these nanites that are made to make super soldiers. So they go ahead and like make her into a super soldier. So now she's a super soldier of the people who were invading her planet. And she's like, what do I even do? Genevieve is the name of the protagonist. Like, Genevieve's like, what do I do with that?
right.
And so the adventure begins because she's left home because her people can't sort of live with that she's like basically been made into a soldier for the enemy. And so she goes and she sort of tries to find a way to kind of sabotage other soldiers. And along the way, like she ends up having kind of a different goal, but that's the one she starts out with, is the sabotage. And kind of looking at coming to terms with this technology. She didn't want it, but it's there now. What's she gonna do with it?
Yeah. Wow. And is she the same character in all the books? As you said that it's over a course of time. Does she stay consistent in all of the books, or is that just the newest book?
So Genevieve is the first two. So
Okay.
her name, and I played with the sort of naming tradition a little bit just to make it a bit different. Her name is Amsterdam Genevieve, and so the Amsterdam Institute is what she founds.
Okay.
So then that carries forward onto novellas 3 and 4, which is Prague Siena, is another person from the planet of Idle, is the name of their planet. And she works at the Amsterdam Institute.
Okay.
And then Pure Motives is book 5 that just came out, and that's a new protagonist yet again, Franklin Chloe. And she ends up eventually at the Amsterdam Institute. She's not a native of Idle like the other two are. So it's sort of Genevieve gets the ball rolling.
All right.
And then the others sort of like touch on the research institute that she founded in their own specific ways.
Okay. What is it that caused? So you mentioned that World of Darkness kind of helped inspire the other series. Was there anything that inspired your love for space operas or this type of genre?
Well, so urban fantasy didn't sort of fit anymore. Any writers who are listening may sort of recognize the feeling of sort of like you're feeling a little bit boxed in, and the tropes feel cliched as opposed to tools to use. They feel like they're confining you. And so I was looking for something new other than urban fantasy.
Okay.
And the thing about my world building is I am not somebody who researches for fun. I research at my day job.
Yeah.
So I'm not looking to go and do more research just for fun. And the other thing is that my academic training has been very strongly that if you don't know, you don't make it up. Because when it comes to archaeology, there's a lot we don't know, and it's very important to say what we do know and then stop.
Right.
And maybe sort of make some extrapolations or hypotheses, or sort of talk about, oh, well, in somewhere else, this was happening, so maybe here, but you definitely say, but we don't know, we only know this, that we have direct evidence for. And that's great for science, and it is not great for fiction writing.
Right.
Because if you're researching a archaeological site, and so they have these huts, and so you have evidence of like where the corner posts are in the ground, and you're like, we don't know what the roof was made of. Yeah. Because like it has decayed, it's gone, we don't know. And we can only say like tribes in the area later use this or that or whatever. But and so I would come to sort of writing, say, historical fiction, which everybody expects that an archaeologist is going to write.
Right.
And I would come to it and I'd be like, okay, here's their hut. What's on the roof? And somebody who like enjoys doing fiction that way would say, oh, well, I'll just think of something that makes sense. Like there's lots of like, pine boughs in the area. Let's just say like pine boughs. And I would be like stuck. I would be like, I can't, no, I don't, what's on the roof? So historical fiction was not for me.
Right.
And so I detoured first into Weird West, which also has an aspect of that, but
yeah.
My Weird West that I actually write in my short fiction. So if you look up R.Z. Held, a lot of my short stories are going to be in a similar-ish kind of world, is far future. And so at that point, it's all sort of, nobody knows what far future might be like. And I just say, okay, so our tech level has sort of like dropped a little bit because of, events of this world,
Okay.
Not gone backward or become uncivilized or anything like that. The tech level is just lower because that's what fits for this world.
Okay.
And that meant that I didn't have to worry because I was just like, well, nobody can say any different. Doesn't matter about evidence. This is what their roofs are on their houses.
Right.
And then space opera is like the next step. It's like super far future with a lot of tech. And it's expected that you don't have to sort of like have research for it, because certain types of science fiction, sort of hard science fiction, you need to like base it on gravitational principles or
right.
Whatever. But space opera, there's much more a sense of like, so yeah, the like ray guns, they go pew pew pew, and like the spaceships, they like zoom around,
right?
And there's like anti-gravity and like artificial gravity, and like you're all good. Like
they move in atmosphere, just like out of atmosphere.
yeah, right. And I'm like, this is for me. And so having the world set up where I'm like, everybody knows that these aren't based on real scientific principles, and everybody's, or they're not 100% based on current science. There's some sort of extrapolation. Lets me then base it on cultural principles and not sweat the gravity, and just get to the fun parts.
Right. What is your favorite part about writing short stories and novellas as opposed to full-size novels? Because you seem to have a lot of short stories out there.
Yes. The fun part of short stories is that people will sort of paint the rest of the world just from a little view. And so you can focus on making a really great little view, and you don't have to build out like 100% of the world. I mean, that's equally true in a novella or novel, because you can't build out everything or it gets
Right.
really, really long and really, really boring.
Right.
But the feeling of sort of like taking my flashlight out and shining it on like one corner, and just playing with what's visible in that corner and what does that sort of indicate about the rest of the world. But we're not looking at the rest of the world, we're just looking at this little corner. I really love that, because you can suggest all kinds of stuff, but then you can just really focus in on the character emotion, and you don't have to worry about, I like to say, the tyranny of the hypothetical pedants, which is this idea that like if you don't get every sort of detail right in something that you're writing, the pedants are going to come after you
with their pitchforks.
right. And short fiction, like, it's a little bit more sort of relaxing to be like, you know what, no, like, everybody knows that you're only seeing one corner, and so they're not going to worry too much about what's everywhere else. So let's focus on the character emotion and the themes, because I'm what draws me into a story is very much more the character above all.
Is there something that you prefer? Like, some people prefer writing dialogue, some people prefer writing action or sequence or describing imagery.
Sure.
Where do you kind of feel like you fall as far as what you enjoy writing when it comes to those?
My dialogue skills came first. So those are like, okay, we're good, let's develop the other stuff. So it's fun, but I enjoy other things too, because there's a you know, with any skill, there's the sort of like the challenging parts.
Right.
So the dialogue is the easy part for me, and then other stuff is the challenging part, which can be just as fun sometimes. Sometimes you want to challenge yourself a little. And I forget the name for it, but oh, so the full version, which I don't have, is called, I think, aphantasia, which is where you can't make a picture of anything in your mind. Like,
Yep.
you think only in words and sounds.
Yep.
So I don't have that, but I have not as detailed ability to make pictures as some people. I like to say that rather than a painter's palette and a canvas, I have Photoshop.
Okay.
In that I can composite things I have already seen.
Right.
And so if you are trying to describe to me with words like an 18-eyed, bug-eyed alien centipede, I mean, I'm working from like centipede and like eyes, and that's real tough.
Right.
But if you're describing to me like a tabby cat, like, I've seen many, many tabby cats, so that's much easier for me.
Yeah.
And so description is tough for me, because when I'm reading, I need about the level of description of sort of a rehearsal of a play where all the characters are there, all the dialogue is there. Maybe you have a couple of like flats up for the scenery, and you have the key props. Like if somebody answering a phone, like there's a phone on stage, but the costumes aren't there, the hair's not done, the rest of the like furniture that they don't interact with on the stage, that's not there. And so my tendency when I first started out was to write that way, where I'm like, well, I just told you she's on the phone. What, you want me to describe like the room? I don't care about the room. I didn't care about the room.
Right.
And so that took more building up of my skill to say, yes, people are going to be wondering about the room because they paint a sort of 360-degree picture for all their senses of what's going on. So let's give them some details. But at the same time, you can go too far.
Yeah.
Because you definitely don't want to be sort of like, okay, there's a chair, and then 60 degrees, there's this, and it's got this and that, and then over here there's that furniture. Like, you go around the whole room, that's a whole novel in and of itself.
Right.
Getting too detailed. So that was a learning experience for me, was to and I think that it could be one of those situations where because I don't visualize very well, I'm hopefully working to write so that stellar visualizers have something, but then also visualizers like me who aren't visualizing as much, they also have something as well. So I'm hoping that I'm sort of finding a middle ground so that both of those types of readers can find something in my work. And I
Right.
think if I was just a stellar visualizer, I would just be sort of giving all the visualization that somebody like me would need, and um, that might not be as good for people who can't visualize to the same level.
Right.
So
And I am there's iconic, maybe not iconic, but there's a thing that side note, here I'm just stammering over my words. My wife also can't visualize things, so very oftentimes I'll explain, here's it's a blah 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 blah, and she'll be like looking at me like she's lost. And I'm like, grab a piece of paper so I can draw it out, so that she's like, oh, okay, because it's very much that same thing. And there's a scale where it shows, it's like somebody describes an apple, which one are you? And the first thing is just a like a beautiful apple with full color and 3D textures, and then there's like it's colored and you can kind of see like where the shine of the light is and the thing and the kind of the background. And then the next one, it's almost black and white. And then the next one, it's like just gray, like almost pixelated. And then the last one, it's like nothing. I don't see anything. And it says people are on this is the scale of how people visualize when you tell someone, can you picture an apple? Or they go, I know what one looks like, but I can't close my eyes and see one there. So that's a really amazing thing, to be able to keep that in mind when you're writing your books, to keep those people in mind. However, if you have a hard time with that, how do you write a space opera where you have futuristic stuff? And if you haven't seen it, how do you describe it?
Photoshop skills,
Oh,
as it were. So it's all about the creative compositing.
okay.
And sort of taking a place you have seen, and then taking like a build. Well, so for instance, my background on the podcast, you won't be able to see this, but my background is a picture of the Columbia Gorge. It's a historical tunnel. It was built in, I think, 1917.
Okay.
So I figured it was pertinent. But then it's also got the sort of scree slopes and the basalt layers of the rock where they cut in, and the vegetation and all that sort of stuff. And that's a real sort of geological place that I have a photograph of, and I can describe that to people to evoke it. But if I put a spaceship in it, then it's a different feel.
Okay.
And so working with that spaceship, I'm like, okay, don't want to make it like, say the space shuttle or something like that. But I've seen plenty of sort of people's art of different kinds of spaceships and, things like that, to sort of take, I don't know, a cool fancy car and say maybe it's got similar kind of like shiny chrome and smooth layers, or maybe it's much more sort of like a Humvee where it's like really blocky and got kind of like external pipes and stuff on it. And just working from things I have seen that capture a similar sort of like, because a custom car is trying to maybe not be fast, but look fast.
Right.
And look shiny and all sort of capture like, yeah, this is luxury. And some beat up Jeep that's been through the mud it's functional and it's for a purpose, and what purpose is it for?
Yeah.
And so looking at, okay, does my spaceship, do I want it to be luxurious and a rich person's toy? Do I want it to be functional, like that they're going around through asteroid fields in it?
Yeah.
And then using different sort of things as the basis.
So you can kind of get the aesthetic of kind of how it feels to the people. That makes sense. Jumping subjects here, there is a couple of things that you've been participated in. There's a magazine called Beneath the Ceaseless Skies magazine. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Beneath Ceaseless Skies was actually started by an Aussie graduate.
Okay.
He was in a year earlier than mine, Scott Andrews. And it does, it's an e-zine and it does secondary world fantasy. And I can't recommend it highly enough, not just because Scott has published several of my stories, but all the stories on there.
Right.
I feel like he has a really great sense of finding fantasy stories that are very uh, lyrical, but it's not about just sort of being pretentious and look at how I can use words, but they're lyrical in service of the deep emotional truths of the characters.
Okay.
And so I was really honored to be able to um, have my work accepted into that, because I love that style of fantasy myself.
Okay.
And as you could probably guess, because I'm not reading descriptions just to read descriptions, I'm reading descriptions because I want them to evoke emotions in me.
Right.
And I feel like Beneath Ceaseless Skies is really good at picking like those type of stories. Among all the magazines sort of are really great at but various ones are great at that. But Beneath Ceaseless Skies is just one that happened to speak to me. So
How do they go about? Did you go to them? Did they come to you?
so it's standard sort of slush procedures,
Mm-hmm.
as for many of the speculative fiction markets. In terms of you don't need to be agented or anything, and then they're open at various times of the year. I think Beneath Ceaseless Skies is open nearly all the year. Some magazines, like I don't know, Strange Horizons only has like a couple sort of open periods, and then you submit and hope they accept you.
Okay. Fair enough.
It's the sort of I've had compared to some of my friends, I haven't had a ton of short stories published, but I've had a few, and my tracking spreadsheet for rejections as well as acceptances is super, super long. And not only like rejections on other stories, but rejections on the stories that eventually sold, like those very stories. Plenty of rejections on those too. So it's a pretty typical kind of short story. When trying to publish short stories, like you want to write a bunch, submit a bunch, and then eventually sort of work on as you work on honing your craft. If you're lucky, then you'll happen to fit the vision that particular editors have for their magazines or anthologies, and then you could start getting into them. But it's not just about talent either. It's about fitting an editor's vision, because
Right.
what's good for one editor might not be for another.
Yeah, because somebody might want a certain aesthetic, like you were talking about, of a sci-fi, and somebody else be like, "We already got 5 of those. Give me something else."
Yeah.
So that totally makes sense. But a lot of the people that we have on, they don't necessarily do a ton of short stories, or they do, and they're just like
Sure.
they're filled in. And so it's nice to see your point of view on that, because you do have that. You do have a lot of these things, some of your anthologies, and literally you look on Goodreads, and there's like, you look under your name and there's just like this list of anthologies. It's like, this is super cool to get to work, with all these anthologies. How is it to work with all those and the other people that are in those anthologies?
It's very interesting, because I feel like it depends on the editor and the publisher what the process is going to be like. And so I've had really, really great experiences with all of the editors. I'll say that right off the bat. But there's a story or an anecdote I'll tell, where I won't name the publisher because it's a small press, and I don't know if
Right.
they're even still running, but they did copy edits, but they didn't send them back to me.
Oh.
So fortunately, I saw the story at the page proof stage, which is where it's all like laid out.
Yeah.
And so they did give it back to me at that point, and I found this really like super clunker of a sentence. And I'm like, I can't believe I would have written that, because
Right.
I assumed it was from something that I had, that a typo that had got
Yeah.
caught. But their copy editor had just happened to sort of value rigid adherence to some particular comma rule over sentence flow. And so the story had become full of all these clunky sentences, and I went through and I like fixed all of them, because I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't care about your comma rule. I want the sentence to flow.
Right.
And the most frustrating part about that, because that's a pretty typical, like, you hope it doesn't happen, but a lot of authors have sort of encountered that, which
Yeah.
is that like you don't get stuff to go over it when you should. The frustrating part was that I was describing a character, and she's a apple dryad or something like that. And so I was saying she was very rounded.
Okay.
Like, she's got sort of a blush on her cheeks, and so she rounded hips and sort of rounded belly and rounded breasts and sort of round, right? And so it came back to me and it said she was rounded in all the right places. And I was
Wow.
like, absolutely not. Like,
Wow.
say, if you want to like back it up, so I say bust instead of breast, like, fine. But absolutely not rounded in all the right places, because that's sexualizing.
Yeah.
And she's a dryad, and the way I had written it, like, she doesn't have sex. Like, she makes seeds. It is part of the magic, and that didn't even happen in the story. And so, like, no, don't be sexualizing my non-sexual dryad.
Right.
And so I was so happy that I was able to catch that. And I was like, okay, fine. So I just was like, she was very rounded, her hips were rounded, and her cheeks were rounded, or something like that. And I'm like, well, we'll go to that. It's fine. I don't care about the original version. Just don't do that to my poor character.
Yeah. Well, and that's a point of view thing too. Like, that's obviously some. That's sorry. I'm angry on your behalf. So we talked earlier about you were doing LARPing. We talked about that. You're on a show called Dungeon Scrawlers. When did the role playing start?
Oh, well, so it started late. I feel like, compared to many writers who have stories about how they were, they knew they wanted to be a writer when they were 4 years old or whatever. And I was like, I admitted that I wanted to be a writer when I was like 16. Like, I wrote some stuff in school, like you do. But I think I always was a writer, but I didn't admit it till I was 16 or so. As a teen in high school, I went to a math and science magnet school. And so there was the focus on that. And so we got a lot of geeks there. But for whatever reason, we weren't particularly D&D geeks.
Okay.
And I don't know if it was because that was pre D&D, being quite as big as it is now. I think it was back in third ed, maybe.
Okay.
And or what it was, but I didn't play D&D until I got to undergrad and college. And so when I got to college, that was sort of a big enough pool of various sort of role-playing things that, like, I got into the LARP, and LARP wasn't quite right, but then I did D&D and doing this and doing that. And so that's when I first started getting into the role-playing in a big way. And then in graduate school, I got into mud gaming. And I always want to say moo gaming because it's MU asterisk to encompass all of it, but you say moo gaming and people sort of like look at you when you're saying it verbally.
Yeah.
So I'll say mud, because I'm sure one of the versions of it was a mud as opposed to a mush or a muck or whatever.
Right.
And that was very formative for me as well. I think Jim Butcher was in mud gaming at some point, and he ended up, I think, stopping because he needed the writing time.
Yeah.
And I ended up stopping because the one I was on at the time sort of had dissolved a little bit, because people, the GMs are going off to different things or whatever. And I just didn't sort of pick it back up again. And now I think that it would cut into my writing time.
Right.
But I have Dungeon Scrawlers instead,
You
so I
have
can still
Dungeon
keep on my
Scrawlers.
gaming.
And for those that don't know, Dungeon Scrawlers is a show on Twitch where they role play, and for all of your entertainment. You guys have people who are listening to the show we've had Eric to be on twice now, and we talked about that quite a bit. And we're going to eventually have everybody from the show on this show. Eventually, we're getting there. We're getting there. So you're here now, and so it's all about you. Tell us about your character. You want to tell us about your character. Everybody wants to talk about their character.
I do. I hadn't played D&D for quite a while, like for a good long time, as far as like I'd done a pickup game or two, but so I got into Dungeon Scrawlers and I made this character. And I'm like, okay, yeah, this is the character that I really, really, really wanted to make. It was in me. So I play a half-elf sorcerer named Artemisia, and she's the whatever it's called, dragon lineage, or so she's got the scales, and at level 14 she gets wings. We're level 13.
You're getting there.
Almost so close. Viewers of the show will laugh because I've started playing up her like thing about wings. But I really enjoy sorcerer is actually my favorite class, because I do tend to go more spellcaster than fighter. And if I'm going to go spellcaster, I usually want to go sorcerer, because I enjoy the idea of having a character whose magic is inherent, as opposed to a character who just says the right words and sort of waves their hand around in the right way to be able to tap into magic.
Have you gotten a lot of experience in GMing?
So I did mostly playing. I did DM once, and that's available on YouTube if people want to look it up. I had a ton of fun because I DM'd an archaeology episode.
Nice.
So we went to Mithranor, which, if people know the Forgotten Realms, is a sort of old elven city in ruins. And so there was an archaeological dig in Mithranor. And of course, there were other things going on for our characters. It wasn't just that they went and like got to view the archaeological dig. But I was like, when you view the archaeological dig before the like magic breaks out, you're running around or whatever, that is going to be the most correct archaeological dig.
Well, that sounds exciting though, because you get to use your knowledge and background in role playing, and that's a great tip to give people, to use what you know in GMing.
Yes. Yeah.
So do you look forward to doing more GMing, or are you like, nope, I'm just going to stay being a player?
Well, so the next thing would be, because I'm one of these charity streams, I might see if there's interest from like guest players to go to the archaeological dig or something like that. But the next step would be, I'm not super comfortable with combat.
Okay.
The DMing I did with the archaeology episode, there was plenty of sort of like problem solving and investigation and ability checks to sort of like, jump or do whatever you needed to do. But I didn't run any monsters.
Okay.
So I know that that's a skill that I would want to sort of put training wheels on and get comfortable with before I was DMing regularly. And I know it's a matter of just sort of like picking a monster and getting your feet wet. But
and doing it, it's trepidation.
Yeah,
we have a show for those that are listening to the podcast as well. We have another show that's just on the stream, and it goes on YouTube, where it's a Dungeon Masters workshop. And so we get people on. We had Eric on, and we had Ed Greenwood and a handful of others. And we just did our last one this weekend, where it's literally tips to help people be better GMs, and people come in and ask questions. So feel free to come and send me questions you have, and I will make them part of the shows, because
how do I monster?
Do I really need to do combat, or can I skip the whole dang thing and
exactly.
do archaeology? Yes. All right. Is there any events that you have coming up?
So I'm doing 2 in-person conventions this year.
Okay.
And one of them has passed. So the other one, your one chance, is MissCon in Missoula, Montana. And if you're anywhere in that area, I highly recommend it, not just but because it is the most friendly, little speculative fiction community that you will ever find. It is just so much fun. I'm really looking forward to that. So that is Memorial Day weekend.
May 27th through 30th, I believe.
Yes, yeah. And then yeah, so
And
that's my one for the year.
what do you just have? Will you just have a booth there? Will you be signing autographs? All of the above? Will you be working with other people?
So it's the style of fan convention where there's a lot of panels for the
Okay.
pros who are attending. So I'll be talking on panels, and panels can be anything of like, let's discuss themes and, you know, this kind of book, or how aspiring writers, how do you do dialogue well, or, you know, runs the whole gamut. And then I suggested, I don't know if there will be room space. I suggested a couple sort of like workshops for like me doing a little bit more of like, I take 45 minutes and I talk about some strategies for, you know, writing this or writing that.
Right.
And I'm sure there'll be an autograph session. I'll probably do a reading. So a little bit of everything, one of those
Okay.
kind of conventions.
Awesome. And again, that's May 27th through 30th. Of course, you can also find her on Dungeon Scrawlers, and there's Twitter and YouTube and on Twitch. So Dungeon Scrawlers can be found at all of those locations with all of your favorite authors. Also, your website, rhiannonheld.com.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
On Twitter at Rhiannon Held. All right, friends and enemies, May 16th, we will be joined by New York Times bestselling author and award-winning game designer Matt Forbeck. Known for his tie-in fiction such as Halo, D&D, and Warhammer, the Marvel Encyclopedia, as well as his work on Deadlands and the new Marvel RPG that's coming out. So he's going to be joining us May 16th. May 30th, Rhiannon's fellow dungeon scrawler, Erin Evans, is going to be joining us today. Happy birthday to Erin today. She will be joining us. She's known for her Brimstone Angel saga and Empire of Exiles, as well as being a content creator for the Idle Champions video game. So that's going to be May 30th. So don't forget, Rhiannon's new book, Pure Motives, is now available, so check it out. And if you like the show, rate and review it. It helps us get eyes on us and get eyes on our guests, and that's what's most important. So make sure to do that, everyone. So for Rhiannon Held, I am Nick, and thank you all for listening to Epic Realms.